Jonathan, you did a true crime episode for us about dead groundhogs.
Yes, in a small town, and conspiracies and cover-ups and, sadly, gruesome deaths.
Not the groundhogs.
Yeah, and the deep secrets at this heart of this small town that relies on groundhog-based tourism.
Maybe I'll start off by saying I think you should read children's books because the way that you delivered this episode was incredible.
Noor, this is my kid's favorite episode of CANADALAND.
I swear, it's so good. The way that you delivered it was incredible. And like the story itself is super interesting. But I think your approach was really, really cool.
Liam Casey, who's a Canadian press reporter, one thread that's running through his work is sometimes funny, but still serious reporting on animals and animal welfare, like whether it was Marineland or battles between the different clans of like baboons at the zoo. Because he's the person who figured out that like, oh, you can FOI medical records of like animals at the zoo because there's no privacy rights, right? You can get their medical files.
Animals don't have privacy rights.
Well, exactly. So he had a tweet, I later put in the roundup of the best tweets of 2021. It was like, do you know something about Wiarton Willie or any of the dead Willies? Get in touch. He'd been really onto the story of like, what are these like weird cover-ups going on in Wiarton, Ontario around all sorts of weird stuff befalling these groundhogs there, and the town being often kind of evasive about what had happened.
Here is Dead Willies. A warning that details in today's episode might be disturbing for young listeners. There are certain lies that we tell to children. We tell them that somebody out there is keeping score, that morality matters. There's a list, and the good will be rewarded. Others will get nothing. We tell them that simply growing older is an achievement, and that the very teeth that fall from their skulls have value. And we tell them that our collective release from the deathly grip of winter can be anticipated by a rodent's shadow. We invest in these lies. We sneak into our children's rooms at night. We wear disguises. And our politicians collude with us in perpetuating them. This is a story about Groundhog Day. It's a story about deception, about cover-ups from elected officials. It's a story about imposters. It is a story, some say, about murder. The true story of Wiarton Willie. CANADALAND News Editor Jonathan Goldsbie brings us his investigation in a moment. Wait for it.
What about Wiarton Willie? I think he's buried under the straw. It's got to be what's going on because I'm not seeing him.
What they appear to have hidden in the past is when a Willie dies.
I'll bet he has died and they're just not letting on.
There's some mystery to this, okay? So this past Groundhog Day, Wiarton appeared via a pre-recorded message. So everyone was like, hey, what's up with Wiarton?
He kept saying, like, I shouldn't be telling you this. The town doesn't want this to get out.
The dead of winter can be a dreary time. It feels as if there's nothing to look forward to. The weather keeps us all pent up inside. By February especially, the darkness seeps in. It's as true now as it was in 1957, when our story begins. It all started with a ghost. Groundhog Day is rooted in medieval Europe in the Christian festival of Candlemas, when farmers would purify their lands by carrying torches in procession before sowing time. But in 1957, in the town of Wiarton on Ontario's Bruce Peninsula, the iconic celebrations emerged from the imagination of one man, Mac Mackenzie. Mackenzie, who was an assistant to Ontario's health minister at the time, hoped to liven up the dreary season with a midwinter gathering at a local bar. Half in jest, he also drafted a news release that circulated around the provincial legislature. Not one to pass up a scoop, the Toronto Daily Star dispatched a reporter to travel the 220 kilometers northwest to Wiarton. when that reporter arrived, there was no groundhog to be found. Simply an idea of one. The essence. The spirit. That journalist, Frank Teskey, knew he couldn't return to his editors with no story and no photos. So some men took a fur hat from atop a woman's head, placed it in a mound of snow, and made Wiarton's first Groundhog Day forecast. "Ghost of a groundhog," read the cut line in the newspaper, under a photo of a woman, Susan Smiley, clutching a fur hat with pearl buttons. That was as close as she or anyone else that day would come to a live creature. The first Groundhog Day in Wiarton, Ontario was a sham. And the residents, the town, the media, they were all in on it. Mackenzie himself kept the secret for over 40 years. But from that day, a tradition was born. Frank Teskey was hardly the last reporter to show up to Wiarton's Groundhog Day festivities. And it was far from the last time that Willie, in fact, wouldn't. There had been stories over the years. Little bits and pieces sprinkled here and there. But just last fall, Canadian press reporter Liam Casey started looking at just how far the deception ran.
So just to confirm, so you're the General Assignment Ontario reporter for Canadian Press, or what is your title?
Yeah, I'm I think technically a reporter editor with the Canadian Press in the Ontario Bureau, so I can cover anything and everything kind of news related. So not sports, entertainment, or business, but everything else kind of thing.
You've been there for about 8 years now?
I started there in January of 2015. Ironically, my first out-of-town assignment was Groundhog Day that year.
So what was your experience of going to Wiarton?
So I had never been to Wiarton before, and CP diligently covers Wiarton Willie and Groundhog Day every year, and usually sending up a photographer and a reporter. It was minus 16 on February 2nd with a wind chill of minus 24. I specifically remember how cold it was that day. And it happens at 8:07 a.m. when they do the announcement.
At 8:07, Wiarton Willie is brought out onto the main stage in a plexiglass box lined with some hay.
Oh, yay! Welcome to the break of dawn groundhog prognostication. It's like a groundhog Super Bowl.
He's not just any old groundhog. He's albino. Like Sean Patrick Flannery in the 1995 movie Powder, his albinism is not unproblematically suggested to be linked with his special powers. Maybe his genetic makeup fine-tunes his sensitivity, a Willie representative told the Globe in 1990.
Wiarton Willie has studiously examined the wind flows, scrutinized the ocean currents, and studied the cloud formation for months.
So he raises his little white head and whispers his prediction into the ear of the town's mayor, who is said to be uniquely versed in the marmot equivalent of Parseltongue, groundhogese.
So now Wiarton Willie shall secretly divulge in groundhogese to Mayor Jackson his uncanny weather prediction for her worship to reveal to the world.
When Liam attended the event 7 years ago, it was the first ceremony presided over by Mayor Janice Jackson, who had taken office just 2 months earlier.
She kind of leaned in and, supposedly listened to what the alleged weather prognosticator said and then announced it to the crowd. And, there was a couple hundred people there, even though it was so cold. It's a big deal up in Wiarton. There's a lot of pomp and ceremony on the day of the festival. Like, everyone's dressed up in this kind of old-time clothing. And there's a park there where there's a huge statue of a groundhog. A lot of snowmobilers come in. There's parties. Like, up until the pandemic, the restaurants and bars would be packed. It's very difficult to get a motel room in town. A lot of us have had to stay in Owen Sound the night before and then make the drive in. It's a fun party.
A fun party indeed. And the stakes for the town are set. Its identity is tied up with Willies, who brings in the tourists and the dollars. Lose Willie, lose it all. But this is something for which the town had long been prepared. With a decades-long legacy riding atop a mystical marmot, no single Willie could be expected to carry the torch alone.
I was just interested in, where they get the Willies. They get tips from all over the province and the country if they hear of an albino or a white groundhog, and they would go out and trap it. And they like to have a few in their possession in case a Willie dies, so that there's a backup.
They call them Understudies, or wee Willies. An imposter by any other name would sound as duplicitous. In 2017, the town's preparation and succession planning paid off.
Like a Willie died in 2017. They had the understudy there, so then they did like a funeral. It was in the summertime, and there's I think CTV video of it, and they kind of turned that into an event.
He may have just been a rodent in a box, but for the town of Wiarton, Ontario, he was Willie. Wiarton Town Council announcing that Willie, the prognosticating albino groundhog, has passed away at the ripe old age of 13, more than 3 times the lifespan of an average groundhog.
But the 2017 funeral was not the first Willie send-off, but it sent journalists digging for stories of Willie's past. And what they found took them far down the burrow.
And in 1999, Willie died about a week before Groundhog Day. And there was no understudy. The understudy had died, and so they didn't have any white groundhogs. What ended up happening is they keep this to themselves, and they rule out Willie. People are, at this point, nobody knows, and there's a couple hundred people there, including children. And they unveil a casket.
A funeral service for a departed Willie, complete with creepy pennies on the eyes. But it turned out this cadaver was a fake. Town officials were forced to admit this was a stuffed groundhog put on display because the original Willie had badly decomposed.
The actual groundhog that had died would have been too gross to put in the casket, so we used a former Willie to take his place.
Children were crying, and so that did not go over well. That made, that was on CNN. It went all around the world. We have our photographer, Frank Gunn, was there that day. He had this photo that literally made it around the world.
Hi, I'm Frank Gunn with the Canadian Press, national photographer since 92, which is when I first covered Willie. Certainly the first of the dead Willies appearances in 99, it turned into a bit of an affair with the little pine coffin and everybody in their tuxedos. And I remember going up and calling into my desk in the morning, and my first line to the desker was something along the lines of, he's dead. Winter's never going to end. And that day was so odd that silly picture of the groundhog in a pine casket was on the front of the New York Times. That's my memory of it. It was just one of those things that struck a chord with so many people for being a marker of how odd the human race is.
A headline in the Globe proclaimed, "Wiarton Willie's corpse a fake, displayed in a coffin for closure." As Bill Walker, the event's coordinator, and now the area's member of provincial parliament, told the Canadian Press, people need to see the body to believe it. And the more you look into the history of Willie, the more you understand why. The Waterloo Record reported in 1991 that for years, the mayor had claimed that he sought out Willie at a secret burrow north of town to bring back the news of his prediction. The groundhog keeper admitted to the reporter there were some years they didn't even have a groundhog at all. One time, in the 1980s, Willie was said to have been kidnapped. But the fog of Willie is so thick that it's not clear whether that even really happened. By 1996, there were reports of Willie receiving threats. Death threats. Sometimes they'd take the form of calls saying Willie should be shot. The Toronto Star reported that the town hall received a note assembled from letters cut out of a magazine. The provincial police were called, and security around Willie was stepped up. Then in 1999, Willie really died. But by that point, it was practically a shell game of dead groundhogs. The town got a new set of Willies soon after, and in 2002 they cut the ribbon on a new municipal groundhog enclosure. The bodies, however, continued to pile up. Here's Global News again.
When early in his reign, 2 understudy groundhogs were killed by a more senior rodent. Officials suspected Willie, but as long as the town square was full of tourists every February, no one asked too many questions.
Willie was blamed for the 2003 murder of his 2 understudies. But just last fall, Liam reported that Willie had in fact been framed.
So I'm reading the old copy, and it had the caretaker's name from 1999, a man named Sam Brewer.
Liam, not wanting to let this thread go, called up Brewer and heard his version of the story.
He had cared for 3 Willies for about 15 years. He took great pride in keeping them, right? And they lived on his property in an enclosure, and he said they were basically like pets. You know, he could pick them up. He told me his fingernails are still, some of them are still screwed up to this day from bites from back then. The Willies that he took care of lived, I think, to 17, 19, and 22, which apparently is very old for groundhogs.
But trouble came for the wee Willies when the town took over care of the animals. Brewer was hesitant to speak at first.
He kept saying, like, I shouldn't be telling you this. The town doesn't want this to get out.
But Liam eventually coaxed the story out.
They decided to make a new enclosure, and Toronto Zoo had helped design this enclosure for them. And he said, basically, the design had this P-trap pipe, like a groundhog hole, you know, and they could come out of the hole into the enclosure, which was kind of open to the public and outdoors. Then they can go back down their little hole into sort of this indoor enclosure, right?
But the enclosure design was flawed. And one day, the P-trap pipe filled with water.
A couple of the groundhogs drowned, and they kept that under wraps.
After being trapped for months alongside the bodies of the wee Willies, the town then pinned their deaths on Willie Prime. That is some kind of nerve. Another mystery. The tunnel, apparently, had not appeared in the original design for the habitat. So, who inserted this watery death trap, and when? This digression into the history of the Willies is crucial, because it lays the groundhog groundwork for what came to pass last winter. On February 2nd, 2021, Liam gets a startling message from his colleague, Paola Lariggio, who was assigned to cover Wiarton Willie's seasonal prediction.
Paola was like, Willie's dead. He's dead for sure.
Because of COVID, Groundhog Day festivities had moved online. A link had been shared for Willie's fans to tune in and for reporters to watch the rodent to make his forecast. Instead of a live stream, however, it was a canned, pre-produced video.
It's a really bizarre video. There's no sign of Willie. In the video, there's a tourism guy who's going around like, where's Willie, where's Willie? And it's really set to this really cheesy music.
There you are. I've been looking everywhere for you. Where's Willie? We need to do a prediction.
And there's no sign of Willie. And then in the video, I think it's the mayor grabs somebody's fur hat and just throws it in the ground.
It's an early spring.
There you have it, folks, from beautiful Wiarton, Ontario. The official prediction. Willie predicts an early spring.
An homage to the original Wiarton Willie Festival. And it just ended. Some heavy hitters in the video too, right? If you've seen, there's the Premier Doug Ford, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, all wishing Willie well.
Whether or not our favorite groundhog sees his shadow, there are brighter days ahead.
Happy 65th anniversary, Willie.
But it turns out Willie's already dead, long dead at that point, but we had no idea.
Is Willie dead or alive? That was not just the question that Liam and others wondered last February 2nd. It was also the headline of a press release the town put out the very next day. The document posed a further query. Would you question the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus? It went on saying, whether or not a groundhog is present on Groundhog Day, the point is for the day to be lighthearted and the community to just have fun! ! Instead of providing answers, the town was seemingly impressed by its own Schrodinger's marmot. But if you want to know the real story and the real history of Wiarton Willie, look for the news that isn't published in February. As winter turned to spring, and spring turned to summer, and summer turned to fall, town officials remained tight-lipped.
When the town put out a short press release on, let me just bring it up here, November 23rd, 2021. 6 sentences long. The fourth sentence says, "Our albino prognosticator sadly passed away, leaving his big brown understudy in charge of making the 2022 prediction."
Not only was Willie dead, the supply of albino wee Willies had run out too. A brown Willie would be the town's new mascot, at least for a year.
And then we had a rather lengthy conversation about Willie in our morning news meeting the next day. And kind of felt to me, and the only condition I had is I didn't want to write a story that Willie was dead. I wanted to see, like, when did Willie die? Like, we just had a lot of questions and there's no real answers. And I just figured, well, what? Let's just take this seriously, because it looks like on its surface that the town and the mayor was, was just lying about Willie.
Accountability was needed. So Liam called the one who speaks the language of Willie, Mayor Janice Jackson.
Usually, like, I've talked to a lot of mayors in the province, and I would say I could usually get a mayor of any given town on the phone the same day that I request to talk to them, whether it's the mayor of Toronto or a small town. And I wasn't getting anything back from the mayor. And, in a lot of these smaller places, they'll put their home number, cell numbers, like, just right on the internet, right? So I was calling Mayor Janice Jackson's home phone, her work phone, email, right? This is pretty serious allegations at this point, right? For me, a bunch of dead Willies. What do you want to say? Nothing. And then kind of the story really went a bit nuts online. So the next morning I was like, well, I'm going to try the mayor again. And then she eventually got back to me and was like, oh, let's do an interview. And it was a tense interview. My first question was, when did Willie die? And she went into, I believe she may have just rehashed the statement from the day before, talking about the history. And it was one of those interviews where, you ask the same question like 5 or 6 times in slightly different ways because you're not getting the answer. In that same interview, she also said the Willie brand is the most important thing in Wiarton, and she's going to protect the Willie brand and protect Wiarton. And that was it. So I still don't know when Willie died.
Liam spoke with Mayor Jackson in November. In the run-up to this week's event, we thought we would try again and see if in the month since she'd pin down the exact date of the beloved animal's death. How long did the most recent albino Willie live?
I'm not totally sure how old he was, but we're thinking about 7 or 8. Yeah, somewhere around there.
When did he pass?
I can't tell you exactly when, but it was before the last prediction.
It seems not. She did explain, however, that the hope of town officials had been to find a new groundhog in time for last year's festival and pretend like nothing had happened at all.
That's something you don't want to have frequently, or, like even every 3 or 4 or 5 years as a Willie funeral, because then they kind of become meaningless.
And so they made the video. The search continued this past summer. High and low, they looked for an albino groundhog, only to come up empty.
Willie means everything to Wiarton, and the Willie brand is growing every year. And really, we were hoping to just quietly find another albino and just kind of make that transition as we have in the past. But it just simply didn't work out that way. And so when we got to the point where the window was closing for us, we realized we were going to have to enter, the next Groundhog Day with a slight transition.
A slight transition being with a brown groundhog instead of a white one. That was what prompted the press release in November admitting to Willie's demise. It is more about paving the ground for the new brown groundhog, than paying tribute to the life and death of the old white one.
I didn't want our community to be stunned on the day. So, but it's amazing the hoopla that it created. But again, it's Willie, and Willie is an icon, and Willie's larger than life up here.
The mayor did reveal a new piece of information, saying that over the course of the past 6.5 decades, she believes that there have been 10 Willies to have taken on the role. And of course, coming up with so many white Willies has been no easy feat, even becoming an international search.
I think I was asked one year, do I have any leads on albino woodchucks, because they needed one.
This is Dan speaking to me last week from a biological research station in French Polynesia. He loves groundhogs, though that's not what he's there studying.
I'm Dan Blumstein. I'm a behavioral ecologist and marmot enthusiast based at the University of California, Los Angeles.
How common are albino groundhogs, and have you seen one, and what did you think when they contacted you?
So there's 15 species of marmots. Groundhogs or woodchucks are one of the 15 species. I've studied 8 of them, and I've spent a lot of time in the field looking at marmots. And marmots range in colors, even within a species. So it's not uncommon to see sort of dark melanistic morphs, but true albinos are really rare. There was an albino yellow-bellied marmot a couple of years ago near where I worked, and everyone's sending me pictures of it, and I went up there and we were looking at it, and my students were trying to trap it and get genetic samples and live trap it. We don't hurt the animals. And, no luck. But they're around every once in a while. I think they sort of stand out against the background, and I don't know how long their lives are. Predators will find them.
So we know the story reveals the sleight of hand, the misdirection, the deception even, around the life and death of Wiarton's very many Willies. But was there any reason to suspect foul play had ended the lives of these woodchucks? Were their Willie deaths, notwithstanding the drowning, perhaps premature? Dan says that groundhogs in captivity typically end up with longer lives than they would have in the wild. The lifespan of the average marmot in the wild is 4.5 years.
Being killed by a predator, freezing to death, starving over the winter, those are causes of mortality in marmots. So I think that captivity, where animals are safe and fed and secure and aren't being killed by coyotes and things like that, that probably enhances their longevity a lot. I think that the record for yellow-bellied marmots is 21 years.
So if we're to believe the mayor, the town's most recent Willie lived to the ripe age of 7 or 8, and that apparently that is an above-average achievement. So then why not be forthright? Liam wants to know who knew what and when.
I do wonder who knew about it. Like, obviously, several people had to have known, right? Like, there's a caretaker. There's council. I think there's 5 members on council. And if this is what the mayor says, that it's the most important event in the town every year, how could other people not know?
The mayor says this year Willie will make an appearance in a live-streamed event, this time, of course, with his brown fur coat.
It's going to look exactly the same as every other year. The only difference is we're not going to have a crowd. So it's unfortunate, It's going to be quiet and a little bit lonely, but it'll still be a lot of fun.
But as another festival nears, in which a Willie will once again be wheeled out onto a stage to make his meteorological prediction, Liam will be unable to bask in the wonder of Groundhog Day. Instead, he will linger in the shadow, thinking only of the long list of questions that remain unresolved.
I do think the public needs to know. The public supports this event. The media has been very good to Wiarton throughout the entire 65 years of this event. And I do think people need some honesty. And there's also, these are animals. These are live creatures. There needs to be some accountability.
All right, well, this is something new for us. If you made it this far, maybe it's working. We have been making podcasts for over 10 years, but video is something new. If you want us to keep doing it, hit subscribe to this channel. It will make a difference. You also might want to hit subscribe to our main channel, and we're going to be posting videos there, exclusive content that we are not putting anywhere else. Also, CanadaLand is a audience-supported news organization. We need people to support us directly, and we have an incredible membership program. You'll get ad-free versions of all of our podcasts. You'll get discounts and exclusive access to our merchandise. You'll get invites and early access and discounts to our live and virtual events. More than anything else, you will be keeping journalism alive in this country. To help us out, and we rely on it, go to CanadaLand.com/join.